Did you know that honeybees can encounter toxic nectar and that it can be a significant stressor to a colony? Let me talk a little bit about this. Plants produce nectar. Bees and other pollinators collect nectar. In our case, honeybees will collect that nectar, eat the nectar, or convert it to honey that they store in the hives for consumption later. But because nectar is produced from plants, nectar is accompanied by more than just sugar water. You get a lot of secondary plant metabolites, a lot of other chemicals that are unique to the species of plant producing that nectar. That's why we get different flavors and aromas and colors of honey, right? All of that's good. But there are some plants out there in the environment that produce chemicals that end up in the nectar that can actually kill honeybees. And if it doesn't kill them outright, it can harm them or the colonies. We call these plants producing this type of nectar, this toxic nectar producing plants. It's real simple. Now, I am not going to go over a list of species of plants that produce toxic nectar. You are watching this from somewhere on planet Earth. What we have happening here in Florida may be different than what you see in Washington State or South Africa or China or wherever you're watching this video. Instead, I just want to make you aware that toxic nectars exist and talk a little bit about this particular issue. So when bees are intoxicated, as it were, from this toxic nectar, how does that look? Well, sometimes the chemicals in the plants can be bad enough that it kills bees outright in the field. That's not usually the case. Usually the bees will come back and appear intoxicated. They might become paralyzed and might die. And if the colony collects enough of that toxic nectar at one time and the bees bring it back to the nest, you can have significant bee die-offs. It doesn't usually happen at the colony level. It usually starts killing bees before it's stored. That's not always the case, but you get almost like pesticide poisoning examples in the adult bees where they're having problems flying, they appear shaky or intoxicated that can lead to paralysis and death. There are some toxic nectars that can actually kill brood. And for example, we have a plant here in Florida that can result in purple brood. When the brood's consuming nectar or honey that's put into their food from these plants, it can turn them purple, it can shorten their lifespan, etc. So you can get adult bee effects, you can get larval effects. The problem is toxic nectar impacts on colonies are not always easy to recognize. In fact, I would argue that they're difficult to recognize because our mind is going to default to another stressor first. Varroa, nosema, nutrition, maybe pesticide poisoning. Our minds are always going to take us there, or they typically will end up on toxic nectar last. So what do you do about this issue? Well, you must do your homework. That's why I'm unwilling to give any plant species names in this video. You need to go to local commercial beekeepers. They will already know if plants that produce toxic nectar are in the area where you keep your bees. They'll say, oh yes, in May, this plant blooms. But don't worry, because this other plant that we want our bees to visit, it also blooms and our bees go there instead. They'll know those kinds of pieces of information. They'll be able to say, hey, listen, don't keep your bees in that area of the county or the province because it has this species of plant that can cause problems in your colonies. And you can be in an apiary for years and years and years, and all of a sudden toxic nectar be a problem and go away. How does that happen? Well, it can happen if the plants that normally get your bees' attention fail to bloom for whatever reason, so they go to less desirable plants and end up on plants that produce toxic nectar. So you really have to check with knowledgeable individuals in your area. That would be beekeepers, extension officers, bee scientists, other people who've been around beekeeping and apiculture for a while in your area. They can point out to you the plants that your bees are likely to encounter. They can tell you if any of the nectars that they produce are toxic. They can tell you what the signs of intoxication are, because again, it varies based on the species of plant from which the bees are collecting that nectar. They can give you all of this information that will prepare you for handling this issue should you encounter it. Now, there is a collateral issue associated with your bees foraging on toxic nectar. Think about it. If they collect it and bring it back to their nest and convert it to honey, and it's there when you collect your supers, the big question arises, can it cause problems for you? Can it cause problems for me? Can it cause problems for a consumer? The truth is it can. That's why it's so important to know what those sources are in your area, if you have those sources at all, and to ensure that your bees are not foraging on it. The good news is human problems from toxic nectar actually occur at really tiny rates. It's certainly not impossible, but it's not something most beekeepers worry about. Usually your colony is showing some sort of sign of intoxication well before it would be concentrated in a nest. I just need you to be aware that plants that produce toxic nectar exist, and if you manage bees close to them, you've got to think about your bees, and you've got to think about yourself and your customers. Keep all of those things in mind when you're siting your bees in an apiary. Find experienced beekeepers, bee scientists, extension specialists, and say, hey, are there any plants in my area that I need to worry about from a toxic nectar perspective?